Wisconsin, Sauk County, hill country, the kind of place that looks the same every morning for 100 years running. This morning is different. A flatbed truck rolls down the gravel lane without calling ahead, without slowing. It backs all the way to the edge of the field and stops. The driver gets out, does not knock on the door, does not introduce himself. He unlatches the chain on the back of the truck, rolls three enormous steel spools off the bed, one at a time, like he has done this 100 times, because he probably has. A young woman in a red flannel shirt steps out of the equipment barn. He hands her a slip of paper and waits. She reads the number written on it, $42, for all three. He drives away. She doesn't follow, doesn't call after him. She stands at the edge of the field, looking at the wire. She opens her notebook. In September 2009, a 22-year-old woman paid $42 for three spools of wire that a manufacturing plant had been paying someone to haul away. 14 years later, that decision was generating $325,000 a year. This is the story of how that happened, and what it cost, and what it was worth. There is a kind of light that falls over Sauk County in late June. Not golden, not postcard, just honest. It comes low through the oak gaps on the ridgelines and lands sideways across the hayfields, and it makes everything look older than it is. The fences, the barns, the farmhouses with their porch screens going soft at the corners. Everything in that light looks like it has been carrying something for a long time. It probably has. Sauk County sits in the south-central part of Wisconsin, a place of hills and river bottoms and dairy operations that have been in the same family names for 4 and 5 generations. The county seat is Baraboo. Most people outside the county know Baraboo only because the Ringling Brothers Circus had its winter quarters there once. A long time ago, the farmers who actually live there know it as the place where the feed store is, where the grain elevator sits at the edge of town with its paint worn thin and its platform scale smoothed by 100,000 truckloads of corn. The land here is not flat, not the Black Prairie kind of flat that makes central Iowa look like a table. Sauk County is hilly and irregular and beautiful in a way that makes it genuinely difficult to farm efficiently, which is why the families who stayed learned over generations to be creative with what they had. The Dahl family had been in Sauk County since Fenna's great-grandfather arrived from the Netherlands in 1923. $60, a letter of introduction to a Dutch Reformed congregation in Reedsburg. He bought 40 acres on a south-facing hillside and planted potatoes and hay and kept 4 dairy cows. His son expanded. His son's son did the same. And by the time Peter Dahl was farming the land in the summer of 2009, the family held just under 200 acres. The flat-bottom ground in corn and soybeans. The hillside parcels in rotation hay. Because that was what everyone in the county did with hillside parcels. Because that was what made sense. Because no one had found a reason to do anything else. Not yet. Fenna came home in the second week of June 2009, 22 years old, a degree in agricultural economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the canvas tote on her shoulder. 4 years of library research in the notebook tucked under her arm. And somewhere underneath both of those things, something that felt like conviction or stubbornness. She had not yet figured out the difference. The drive from Madison to Reedsburg takes about an hour and a half if you take Highway 12 through Sauk City. She had made that drive dozens of times, knew every turn, every gas station, every stretch of road where the hills opened up and you could see the farms laid out in the valley below. But this time she pulled over, twice. Not because anything was wrong, just because she needed to look. At the hills, at the south-facing slopes with their angle of light, at the parcels she had been reading about in university libraries for 4 years. She sat in the car on the shoulder of the road with the windows down, and she did not reach for her phone. She just looked. Fenna Dahl at 22 did not look like anyone's idea of a business strategist. She looked like someone who had grown up on a farm, because she had. Light skin with a faint, warm undertone, the kind that comes from childhood summers spent outdoors rather than indoors. Freckles across her nose and cheeks that had never fully gone away and that she had stopped trying to wish away around age 15. A face that was softly oval, slightly heart-shaped at the jaw, with large light blue-gray eyes that caught the summer light and held it a beat longer than seemed strictly necessary. Her medium brown hair was pulled back in a low, loose ponytail. Several strands had escaped at her temples. She had not retucked them. She was wearing her red and cream plaid flannel shirt even in June. Old habit. The flannel was worn at both elbows. She had stopped noticing that years ago. She looked at the hills and thought about what she had been reading. Cold, hardy grape varieties developed at the University of Minnesota. Marquette, Frontenac, La Crescent. Varieties bred to survive -30 winters and still produce fruit with enough sugar content to make commercially viable wine. Research data showing consistent yields of 4 to 6 tons per acre on properly managed trellis systems. Revenue potential of $800 to $1,200 per ton at regional winery prices. The hay on those exact same hillside parcels. Net of input costs, a good year, around $140 per acre. She ran the math in her head for the 100th time. The ratio did not change. She pulled back onto the highway. The kitchen table at the Dahl farm was the same table it had been for 31 years. Oak. Solid. Peter had bought it at an estate sale the spring he and Siv moved in. Never replaced because nothing was ever wrong with it. That was a Peter Dahl principle. You replace what's broken, not what works. Fenna sat across from him that first evening home. She put the notebook on the table between them. She explained it clearly. The varieties, the research, the revenue projections, the trellis system she was planning to build on the South Hillside, the back 40 specifically, the one that had been in hay for 11 years because the irregular terrain made row cropping difficult and no one had figured out a better use for it. She laid out the photocopied research data, spread it across the table. Peter watched her the way he watched everything. Without hurry, Siv refilled everyone's coffee. Twice, without being asked. When Fenna finished, Peter looked at the photocopies for a long moment. Then he set down his mug. Not hard, just deliberately. I need to think about it, he said, which from Peter Dahl was not a no. From Peter Dahl, that was the beginning. SIV looked sideways at her husband, then at her daughter, then back at her coffee. Something moved quietly across her face. There and gone. Fenna nodded, picked up the photocopies, stacked them neatly, put them back in the folder. She went upstairs, sat on her old bed in her old room, opened the notebook to the revenue projections and read them again, just to make sure they still said what she thought they said. They did. She walked the South Hillside alone the next morning. She had walked it 100 times growing up, as a kid trailing behind her father during fence checks, as a teenager on horseback, as a college student home for Christmas, looking out at it from the kitchen window. But she had never walked it the way she walked it now, with graph paper folded in her back pocket, a compass borrowed from the equipment barn, the specific intention of counting the things that were there instead of the things that were not. The terrain was not easy. The slope varied. Sections where the grade steepened, sections where it leveled off into small natural terraces that 4 generations of Dahls had never figured out what to do with. The soil shifted from silt loam on the upper sections to heavier clay along the lower edges where water moved after rain. She took notes, paced distances, crouched down and picked up soil with her hands and held it. The land had been in hay so long that the grass was dense and deep-rooted. Getting it out would take work. A cover crop first. A full season of preparation before a single vine went in. She knew all of that. She had read all of that. But standing there on the slope in the June morning, with the light coming in sideways and the valley laid out below her, and the smell of the grass and the soil that had been her family's for 4 generations, she knew it differently. Not from a paper, from her feet. The flatbed truck arrived on a Thursday morning in early September. Fenna did not know it was coming. That was the first thing. She was in the equipment barn with a wrench and a tractor part when she heard the diesel engine come up the gravel lane. She stepped out into the light. The truck was big, a flatbed with wooden stakes on the sides. Wausau Wire Manufacturing Plant on the door in faded lettering. The driver backed it down the lane without looking at her. Just backed it, smooth and practiced, all the way to the edge of the field. He did not knock on the house door. He did not call ahead. He unlatched the chain on the back and rolled 3 enormous steel spools off the truck bed, one at a time, carefully but without ceremony, like he had done this 100 times, because he probably had. Each one stood about 4 feet tall, all wrapped in wire, industrial gauge, hundreds of feet of it still wound tight on the spool. The remnants of production runs at the plant that were too short to fill a commercial order and too long to throw away without someone complaining about the waste. He handed Fenna a slip of paper. She looked at it. $42. For the lot, he said. She looked at the 3 spools, at the wire, at the slip, back at the spools. $42. She reached into the pocket of her canvas jacket, the weathered tan one, with the dark brown hood lining slightly oversized, softened by years of use, the jacket that had belonged to her father before it was hers, and she counted out the cash, handed it over, signed the slip. The driver climbed back in the truck, pulled out of the lane, gone. Fenna stood at the edge of the field. The 3 spools sat there, in the morning light. That was the part she could not explain later. Not to anyone who asked, not even to herself entirely. It was not a vision. It was not a business plan arriving fully formed. It was just a shift, quiet and internal, like a key turning. She looked at 3 spools of wire that a manufacturing plant had been paying to have hauled away, and she saw exactly what she needed. The spools sat at the edge of the field for 3 days, not because she didn't know what to do with them. She had known within about an hour, but she needed time to think around it, through it, from different angles. She walked the south hillside again that first afternoon, then again the next morning. Then in the early evening of the second day, when the light was low and the shadows were long. She had her notebook. She had the graph paper from her earlier survey. And she had the numbers from the university extension publications on high-wire cordon training systems for northern climate vineyards. She started calculating wire quantities by gauge and tension requirement for each trellis position, bottom catch wire, cordon wire, upper training wires. She worked backward from those calculations to figure out what she had and what she still needed. Kept running inventory in her notebook of each spool, approximate gauge, approximate length. It was not enough, not yet, but it was enough to know what she was building, and it was enough to know that the building was possible. She called the Wausau plant on the 4th morning, asked to speak to the manager, a man named Roland Getz. She explained what the spools had been sent for, that she had a use for more, what gauges she needed, what volumes. Getz asked her what she was building. She told him. A beat. Trellis system, he said, like he was writing it down. For wine grapes, she said. Another beat. On a Wisconsin hillside, he said. South-facing, she said. It matters. A sound from his end of the line. Not quite a laugh, not dismissive. More like a man who had just heard something he had not heard before and was deciding whether it was interesting. I can set more spools aside, he said. You'd pay a handling fee on each load. What's the handling fee? Around 45 to 50, depends on the load. I can do that, she said. All right then, Getz said. I'll put your name down. She wrote his name in the notebook. Roland Getz, Wausau Wire. The beginning of an arrangement that would, over the next 13 years, quietly transform almost everything she knew about what was possible. The winter of 2009 going into 2010 was a planning winter. Fenna spent it at the kitchen table. Graph paper, extension service publications, university data on planting density and row spacing for Minnesota developed varieties and Wisconsin microclimates. She sketched the trellis layout in pencil, revised it again. The terrain on the south hillside was not regular enough for a standard grid, which meant she had to plan each row individually, working around the natural contours of the slope, working around the material she had. She also spent it counting wire. 4 more deliveries came from Wausau between October and February. Each time she inventoried what arrived. Gauge, approximate length, which trellis position each piece could serve. It was not like learning to build a thing from a blueprint. It was like learning a different language. Instead of deciding what she wanted and buying what she needed, she was learning to want exactly what she had. To see the wire she had as the shape of the trellis she would build. Not a compromise, a translation. There were evenings when the translation felt impossible. She would spread the inventory pages across the kitchen table and run the gauge numbers against the row requirements and come up short on one section or wrong on another. And the doubt would come in, not loudly. It never came in loudly. It came in the way cold comes in under a door. You don't notice it until you are already cold. What if she had miscalculated the row spacing? What if the Wausau deliveries stopped coming? What if Vernon Haas, and she had not let herself think much about Vernon Haas since June, but here in the November dark with the doubt already inside? What if he had been right about something she hadn't seen yet? She learned to handle those evenings. She would stop, close the inventory pages, open the notebook to the revenue projections, read the numbers, not because the numbers made the doubt disappear, but because the numbers were stable in a way that the doubt was not. Numbers didn't spiral, they just sat there and waited. 4.5 cents per foot coming in, 16 cents market price, $138 per acre from hay. Revenue potential from mature vines at proper density, 2,000 or more on the same ground. She would read them, slowly, all the way through. Then she would go back to the inventory pages and keep working. Peter watched from the edges of all of this. He did not interfere. He did not ask questions she had not invited. He had made one more cup of coffee in November, set it in front of her. Without announcement, looked at the graph paper spread across the table and said, "You're going to need posts." She looked up. "For the anchors," he said. "Post-treatment matters on this slope. Moisture retention is high near the lower terrace." She stared at him. "The woodlot on the north edge," he said. "We have material." He picked up his coffee and walked back out to the barn. Fenna looked at the graph paper, wrote posts from woodlot north edge treated in the margin. He came back in December with his soil records from 12 years of working the hillside parcels. Left them on the table one morning without annotation, without explanation. Just left them there the way you leave something when you want it to be used but don't want to make a thing of it. She used them. Every page. By January, she had 7 deliveries cataloged. Wire lengths cross-referenced against row requirements. A layout that accounted for the actual slope grade at each elevation change. Post specifications based on Peter's moisture data from the lower terrace. It did not look like a standard vineyard installation plan. It looked like something someone had built from what they had, which was exactly what it was, and which was she was beginning to understand not a weakness, but a different kind of precision. Not the precision of a template applied to a space. The precision of a space examined until you understood its actual shape. She was still learning that word, precision. What it really meant when the material was irregular and the ground was difficult, and the only way forward was to think about it harder than the standard instruction told you to. She was 22 years old and learning it at a kitchen table in January. She wrote everything down. The Farm Bureau spring meeting was held at the Reedsburg VFW Hall on a Thursday evening in April of 2010. Fenna had asked for 15 minutes on the agenda. She was told she could have 10. She brought photocopies of the Minnesota research data organized into a single-page summary. Variety, cold hardiness rating, average yield, revenue per ton at regional winery prices, net revenue comparison against hay production on the same acreage. She had practiced. She knew it cold. And she was not, if she was being honest with herself, particularly nervous about the data. She was nervous about the room. Sauk County Farm Bureau meetings in 2010 were attended primarily by men who had been farming this county for decades. Men who had survived the 1988 drought and the milk price collapses of the 1990s and the input cost inflation of the mid-2000s. Men who had watched things tried and watched those things fail and had drawn from the accumulation of those failures a set of conclusions about what worked here and what didn't. And sitting in the third row on the right side, with the posture of a man who had learned to take up exactly as much space as he needed, and not a square inch less, was Vernon Haas. Fenna had known Vernon her whole life. He had been at her parents' 30th anniversary dinner. He had given a 4-H demonstration she had attended at 12. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, a handshake he deployed like a tool, a voice that carried across rooms without effort. I sold agricultural supplies, fencing products, trellis systems, among other things. She noticed that detail as she walked in. She had not until this specific moment thought about it with any particular focus. Now she did. She stood at the front of the room. 22 years old, flannel shirt, canvas jacket, jeans that were clean but obviously work jeans. She had not changed into anything fancier because she did not own anything significantly fancier, and also because this was a Farm Bureau meeting, and the farmers in this room would have noticed and judged accordingly. She laid out the case. Cold, hardy varieties, research data, microclimate advantages of South Hillside terrain, revenue projections, net comparison against hay baseline. She was precise. She was organized. She did not rush. She handed the summary page to the three people nearest her. It passed down the row. She finished. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Vernon Haas shifted in his chair, uncrossed and recrossed his arms, slowly, the way a man does when he has been patient and wants the room to know it. He said he appreciated her enthusiasm. He said wine grapes in Wisconsin had been tried before. He named a farm near Plain that had planted a small vineyard in 1998 and pulled the vines before 2005. He said winters in this county had a way of settling these arguments faster than university studies could. He said, and he chose the word with the deliberateness of a man who knows exactly what his careful word choices communicate, that building a trellis system out of salvage wire from a manufacturing plant was improvised in a way that improvised was a polite substitute for something less flattering. A few people near him laughed. Not mean, just easy. The laugh of people who have seen this movie before. The meeting moved on to the next item on the agenda. Fenna folded her summary page, put it in her jacket pocket, walked to the back of the room. She should have left. She knew that. She had every intention of leaving, walking to her truck, driving the 20 minutes home on the county road with the windows down, letting the cold air do whatever cold air does to a thing sitting too heavy in your chest. Except she was standing in the small entry hall pulling on her jacket when she heard Vernon's voice through the half-open door of the side room off the hall. The storage room, where people went to have conversations they did not want to have on the main floor. She was not eavesdropping. She was just standing still. South-facing slope, say 3 acres to start, Vernon was saying. I've got the trellis kits in stock. Complete system. Commercial spec. Properly gauged wire anchor hardware included. I can have it to you by May. A pause, someone asking a price. It's not cheap, Vernon said, but it's done right. You don't want to improvise a trellis structure. You need commercial spec or you're wasting your time. Another pause. That doll girls thing, I understand the enthusiasm, but you want a proven system. You want something you can stand behind. Fenna stood very still. For a long time, several things landed at once. First, Vernon Haas had been in that room not as a fellow farmer offering expertise. He had been in that room as a salesman, waiting for someone to hear a presentation about vineyard potential and need a system. Second, he had called her plan improvised in a room full of her neighbors, and then walked into the room next door to sell them the alternative. Third, the word improvised had not been a professional assessment. It had been a sales pitch. She walked out to the parking lot, got in her truck, sat there, did not start it. Because here was the thing. Here was the thing her research could not have prepared her for. She had expected skepticism. She had even expected dismissal. But she had not expected this specific thing. The deliberateness of it, the calculation. She was not naive enough to think business was separate from opinion. She had read enough economics to know that markets were not clean, that the people shaping consensus in a room often had something to sell, but knowing it academically, and sitting in a parking lot, having just heard it happen in real time about your own work to your neighbors. Those were not the same experience. The drive home was 23 minutes. She drove with the windows down even though it was cold for April. Still sharp, the kind of cold that had not quite decided to become spring. She drove. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. Her friends from Madison were not farmers. They would not understand the specific weight of being dismissed in front of the people whose opinion of your work would determine whether that work could continue. She loved them. But this was not a conversation for them. She thought about the data, about the South Hillside, about the spools of wire sitting in the equipment barn, about the two questions competing for space in her chest. First, am I wrong? She ran the data again in her head. Cold hardy varieties, revenue projections, microclimate analysis. No, she was not wrong. Second, does it matter if I'm right? That one was harder. She pulled into the Dahl Farm lane at 10:43, turned off the truck, sat in the dark. The South Hillside was a shadow against the darker sky. She could not see it clearly, but she knew its shape. She had been knowing its shape since she was 3 years old. She went inside, sat at the kitchen table, opened the notebook to the revenue projections, read them, again and again. The next morning, Fenna came downstairs at 6:15. Peter was already at the kitchen table. 2 cups of coffee poured, one at her place. He did not look at her. He looked at the window, the way he always looked at the window in the morning. Like the information he needed was written in the specific quality of the early light. She sat down, wrapped her hands around the cup. The barn swallows were starting up outside. A long quiet. I heard him, Peter said, in the side room. She looked at him. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was controlling something carefully. He's been selling commercial trellis kits for the better part of 3 years, Peter said. He has a supplier in Illinois, not cheap systems. He picked up his mug, set it down. He had reason to want the room thinking a certain way. Fenna waited. That doesn't mean he was wrong about everything he said. I know, she said, but it means his opinion had a price on it. She looked at the table. What do you want to do? Peter said. She was quiet for a moment. I want to plant the back 40, she said, and the 2 hillside parcels above it. He looked at the window. All right, he said. He stood up, walked toward the door, stopped. Without turning around, there's more trellis wire than you need for the current layout, if you size it right. I know, she said. He nodded, went out to the barn. Fenna sat at the table alone. She pulled the notebook toward her, opened it to the planning pages for the expanded layout, started making adjustments. She did not hear Siv come downstairs. She did not hear her cross the kitchen. She only knew Siv was there when something was placed on the table beside her notebook. A composition book. Old, the black and white marbled kind. But the covers had gone soft with handling, and the spine had a crack running its full length. The kind of crack that happens when a book has been opened and closed and reopened and then not touched for a very long time. Fenna looked up. Siv was standing by the counter, arms folded across herself. Not the way Vernon folded his arms. The way of someone making themselves wait until the right moment. That was your grandmother's, Siv said. Marta, my mother. Fenna looked at the notebook. She went to university, Siv said. UW-Madison, 1969 to 1972, Agricultural Sciences. A pause. She never talked about it much. I found that after she died. Fenna reached out and opened the notebook. The handwriting was round and careful, taught with a ruler, the kind of handwriting you don't see much anymore. The pages were covered in notes and calculations and small sketch diagrams. She recognized the diagrams immediately. They were trellis layouts. The geometry was different from hers, older methodology, but the underlying logic was the same. She turned pages, variety notes, cold hardiness research, microclimate observations, revenue estimates. Her throat tightened, and then tightened more, because they're running alongside the variety research notes were the same South Hillside observations she had made herself last summer. The same slope measurements, the same moisture retention notes about the lower terrace, different handwriting, different year, same hillside. She turned to the last page with writing on it, calculations, and beneath them in slightly different ink, written it seemed on a different day than the rest. Someday someone will see what I see. Fenna did not move for a long time. She proposed this as her senior thesis, Siv said. Her voice was quiet, controlled. The way voices get when they are carrying something they have carried for a long time. Vineyard potential on south-facing hillside terrain in Sauk County. Cold hardy variety selection. Economic viability analysis. She paused. The department rejected it. Another pause, shorter. She was told it was economically unviable for Wisconsin conditions. Fenna looked at the calculations, the same calculations, different hand, different pen, different year. Why didn't you show me this before, Fenna said, not accusatory, just the question. Siv was quiet for a moment. Because you needed to find your own way there first, she said. If I had given you this before you'd done the work yourself. She stopped, started again. You needed the research to be yours, not something you inherited, not a weight someone handed you. She looked at her daughter. But now you've done the work, Siv said. And last night someone dismissed it in front of your neighbors. And I thought, she stopped. I thought you should know that you are not going somewhere no one has ever gone. A beat. You are going somewhere someone tried to go before you and wasn't allowed to. The kitchen was quiet, the barn swallows outside, the distant sound of Peter in the equipment barn, the stillness of a farmhouse morning when the world has not yet asked anything of you. She would have been good at it, Siv said, very quietly, more to herself than to Fenna. She had the mind for it. She always had the mind for it. Fenna looked down at the last page, at the line in slightly different ink. Someday someone will see what I see. She did not cry, but she sat very still, with the notebook open under her hands, with the sense that the distance between herself and the woman who had written those words was both 40 years and nothing at all. She placed her own notebook beside the old one on the table, opened both to their planning pages. The calculations were not identical. Fenna's were more current, more precise. The Minnesota variety data had advanced significantly since 1971. The UW Extension research on microclimate modeling was more rigorous, but the underlying geometry was the same hillside, the same logic, the same conclusion. Two people, 40 years apart, doing the arithmetic on the same piece of land and arriving at the same number. Fenna sat with that for a moment, then she picked up her pencil and went back to work. Installation began in early May of 2010. The trellis post went in first, cedar cut from the woodlot on the north edge of the property, treated, set at the correct depth for the moisture conditions on the lower terrace, which Peter had, without being asked, calculated from his own soil records. He left those records on the table one morning. No annotation, just left them there. Fenna used them. The wire went in after the posts, and here was where the improvisation became education. No two runs were the same length. The spools from Wausau contained wire in irregular amounts, 200 feet here, 340 there. Some spools with 3 different gauges wound together in the last remnants of separate production runs. A standard installation would have used uniform lengths cut to spec applied to a regular grid. She did not have a regular grid. She had a hillside, and she had what she had. So she did what you do when you cannot impose the plan on the material. You make the plan fit the material, row by row. She worked from her inventory notebook the way a carpenter works from a cut list, laid out each row to match the wire she had for it, adjusted spacing, adjusted anchor placement, walked the length of each row before stringing it, pacing out the tension requirements, thinking about how the canopy would sit on this particular run and what the light exposure would look like at this angle to the slope. It took longer. Anyone driving past on the county road would have seen a girl in a red flannel shirt and a canvas jacket working on a hillside, stopping and kneeling and measuring and adjusting. Notebook open on the ground beside her, building something that did not look like any trellis they had ever seen, because it wasn't. It was something built to the specific shape of what she had and what the land was. Not improvised, specific. There is a difference. She would not have been able to explain that difference in words. Not yet. Not in 2010. She did not have the language for it. She had only the experience of doing it, of solving each row as its own individual problem, of learning by having no other option how to see the actual constraints of a material and build something true to them instead of building a theory and expecting the material to comply. Vernon Haas drove past the property twice that first summer. She noticed both times, because she was working on the trellis both times, and both times his truck slowed at the road. He did not stop. She watched him drive on. Then she turned back to the hillside, picked up the notebook, found the next row on the cut list, and kept going. The first marquette vines went into the ground in the third week of May, 2,200 of them across the initial 2 acres of the first parcel. Fenna planted them herself. Peter drove the tractor for the furrow work, steady and careful the way he did everything. Brought sandwiches at noon and stood for a long time at the edge of the planting, looking at the rows. She did not say anything, but she looked at it a long time. The vines were small, unremarkable, little sticks of rootstock with a few green shoots just beginning to find their orientation. They did not look like wine. They did not look like much of anything standing in their rows on the hillside in the May light, except to Fenna, who looked at them and saw the graph paper and the revenue projections and 2 notebooks open to the same pages on the kitchen table, except to Siv, who stood at the edge of the field and saw whatever she saw. And perhaps to whoever that other woman had been sitting at a desk in a university building in Madison, writing calculations about a hillside she had never been able to plant. The light was clear that afternoon, the kind of honest late spring light that tells you exactly what is there and nothing more. Fenna walked the rows when the planting was done. 1 full pass, checked the post depth at each anchor point, checked the tension on the cordon wire, made 2 small adjustments. Then she stood at the upper edge of the planting and looked down the rows. The hillside stretched below her. The valley opened up beyond it. $42 of wire, 4 years of research, 2 notebooks, 1 hillside that everyone else had written off as unsuitable for anything better than hay. She did not think, "I will prove you wrong, Vernon Haas." That was not actually the thought she had. The thought was simpler. Let's see what this ground can do. She put the notebook in her jacket pocket, walked back down to the barn. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. And she had learned enough in these past 8 months to understand that the work itself was the point. Not the proving, the work, the daily problem solving, the specific intelligence of figuring out what this particular hillside with this particular wire needed from her today. That was the thing. That was what no one in that Farm Bureau meeting had been able to take from her, because they had not understood what she was building. And she had. The first winter tried to take them from her, not all of them, not even most, but enough. She found the damage in March of 2011, walking the rows with the snow still patchy on the ground. The kind of late winter morning that is technically spring on the calendar and absolutely nothing like spring in reality. Cold that had teeth, sky the color of old dishwater. And there in the upper northeast section of the planting, row 7 through row 11, the canes had gone brittle in a way that was different from dormancy. She knew the difference. She had read about the difference. But reading about winter damage and crouching down in the mud in early March to run your thumb along a cane that has no living tissue left in it, those are not the same experience. She counted, slowly, methodically, the way she counted everything, row by row, plant by plant, making small marks in the notebook. 263 vines, out of the original 2,200, just under 12%. She stood up, looked at the numbers, ran them again in her head because the first time she ran them was too fast, and she did not trust herself. Still 12%. She put the cap back on the pen, stood there on the hillside for a long moment, because the research had told her this would happen. The UW Extension publications had been clear about first-year winter mortality on cold hardy varieties in Wisconsin microclimates. Expected range was 8 to 15%. 12 was inside the range. 12 was not a disaster. Except it was 263 individual plants she had put in the ground herself last May, that she had walked back and checked after planting, that she had looked at on a clear afternoon and thought, let's see what this ground can do. And the ground had taken 12% of them back. She did not throw the notebook. She did not sit down in the mud. She stood there for a few more minutes, looking at row 7. Then she walked back down to the barn, found the variety planting records from the previous spring, sat at the workbench, mapped the mortality pattern, where in the hillside, which rows, which varieties. The Frontenac vines on the upper section had held better than the Marquette. The cold air drainage pattern she had noted in her original site, survey the pooling that happened near the northeast corner on still winter nights, had done exactly what she had calculated it might. But she had weighted the Marquette planting too heavily on that section. Her error, not a catastrophic error, a calibration error. She opened the notebook to a clean page and wrote, replanting 2011 spring shift, Frontenac ratio, upper NE section, recheck air drainage notes from site survey. Then she went inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table and ran the numbers on replacement cost. Peter came in from the morning milking, saw her at the table. How bad, he said. 12%, she said. He poured his coffee. Northeast corner, upper rows 7 through 11. He sat down, looked at the numbers she had written. Frontenac next time, he said. That's what I wrote, she said. He nodded, drank his coffee. That was the whole conversation. She replanted that spring. 263 new vines. Adjusted variety mix. Frontenac weighted heavier on the upper northeast section. She adjusted the positioning of 3 anchor posts in row 8 to account for the drainage pattern she had confirmed over the winter. Small adjustments, but precise. Because here was the thing she was learning. And she was learning it the way you only learn things that matter. Not from a textbook, from doing the thing wrong and then doing it differently. Every problem the hillside gave her was a problem she had to solve with what she had on that specific hillside. Not what the manual said about hillsides in general. Not what the extension publications described as typical. This hillside, these rows, this wire, this specific cold air drainage pattern on still winter nights. The improvisation that Vernon Haas had called improvised in front of her neighbors was turning into something else. She did not have a word for it yet. She just had the work. The summer of 2011 produced the first commercial fruit. Small yields. Young vines always give small yields. 2.5 tons per acre on the first planting. Below the research projections. But the research projections had said that was coming, and she had written it in the notebook, and she had not adjusted her long-term numbers because of it. She sold the fruit to a winery in Spring Green, a man named Peters who had been making wine in Sauk County for 12 years. He came out to look at the planting before committing, walked the rows, looked at the trellis system, did not say anything about the irregular wire for a long moment. Then he looked at how the canopy sat. Air flows good, he said. The row spacing is irregular, she said. I built it to the wire I had. He looked at the canopy again, moved to the next row, tilted his head. Airflow's still good, he said. Better than standard, actually. She looked at the canopy. He was right. She had not thought about it in those terms. She had been thinking about tension, about coverage, about whether the fruit would get adequate light. But the way the rows sat, slightly uneven in spacing, because she had planned each one to the wire she had for, it had created a ventilation pattern through the planning. Not a design choice, a consequence. She filed it in the notebook undernote on airflow irregular row spacing revisit. Peters paid her $900 per ton. Net revenue per acre that first partial harvest, $412. She wrote that number next to the hay baseline, $138. Same acre, same hillside, different use. She showed the numbers to Peter at dinner. He looked at them for a long time. I'd like to see what year 3 looks like, he said. So would I, she said. The second winter was milder. The mortality rate dropped to 4%, which was, actually, she had to read that number twice when she counted. 4%. She stood in the snow on the hillside in March of 2012 and counted twice. 3 times, because she did not want to write the wrong number in the notebook. 4%. She wrote it, circled it, looked at it. Then she walked the whole planting, all of it, every row, running her thumbnail along canes at regular intervals, checking tissue, checking bud swell, checking the places where the wire had settled into the anchor positions over 2 winters and what that tension looked like now versus what it had looked like when she set it. The trellis held, every line, every anchor. Held better, honestly, than she had expected. The cedar posts from the north woodlot had weathered into their depth. Set properly, Peter's soil records. She had used them, and they had been right. She stopped at the anchor post at the end of row 4, ran her hand along the wire. The wire was not uniform. 2 different gauges on this single run joined at a midpoint with a splice she had done herself because that was the length she had. When she had strung it 18 months ago, she had worried about the splice, about the tension differential, about whether the canopy would sit right on a run that changed gauge at midpoint. She had run the numbers on it 3 times. Then she had strung it, because she had to. And now she ran her hand along it, and the tension was exactly what she needed, and the splice had not moved, and the row above it had green buds beginning, and the hillside was waking up into its second spring. She stood there, hand on the wire, thinking absolutely nothing, which for Fenadol was a notable experience. What year 3 looked like was this the summer of 2012, which nobody in Sauk County would forget for the rest of their lives, which arrived in June like a verdict, which was the drought. The drought of 2012 was the worst the Midwest had seen in more than 50 years. People who had been through 1988 said that had been bad. People who had been through 1988 said 2012 was worse. It came in June. It did not break until September. By late July, the corn in the valley fields was rolling its leaves in the heat. That tight defensive roll that corn does when it is trying to preserve every molecule of moisture it has left. The pastures had gone from green to yellow to the color of old straw in the space of about 3 weeks. The creek at the bottom of the north property had dropped to a trickle. The county extension office issued 3 separate advisory bulletins in August alone. Fenna read each one. Peter's corn on the flat-bottom ground was already showing the numbers no one wanted to see. The stalks were shorter than they should have been. The ears were forming but thin. At a summer like this one, which had not given the crop what it needed when it needed it. And meanwhile, up on the south hillside, the vines were fine. Not dramatically fine. Not lush in a way that would have made a good photograph. Just fine. The way fine looks when everything around it is not. Which is honestly a kind of beautiful that is hard to describe until you have seen it. The root systems on the 3-year-old vines had gone deep. 2 meters, 2.5 in some cases. Down past the drought-stressed surface soil. Down into the subsoil moisture that the surface heat could not. Plants were drawing on water the drought did not know was there. Fenna walked the rows every morning. August, midday heat that sat on the hillside like a hand pressing down. She checked canopy, checked fruit development, checked wire tension because heat cycles affect tension, and she had been checking it every week all summer. The trellis held, every line, but here was the thing she did not discover until later. After harvest, after the county had tallied its losses and the grain elevator in Baraboo had sat at half capacity for most of September, and there were farmers in this county having conversations with their lenders that nobody wanted to be having. A man from the county extension office came out in October. He was writing a report on drought resilience for the Midwest Agricultural Cooperative newsletter. He had heard about the vineyard. More specifically, he had heard that it had yielded through the drought while everything around it had not. He wanted to understand why. His name was Brant, early 50s, clipboard. The professional calm of a man who has spent 30 years trying to figure out why some things survive and some things don't. She walked him through the planting. He looked at the rows for a while without talking. The way people look when they are measuring something they cannot measure with a ruler. Your row spacing is irregular, he said. I know, she said. I built it to the wire I had. He nodded slowly, looked at the canopy distribution, walked down one row and back up the next. You have better airflow through this system than any commercial trellis installation I've surveyed this year, he said. She looked at the rows. The irregularity is why, he said. Standard commercial spacing is consistent by design, clean, easy to install. But consistent spacing in a dense planting can create pockets of stagnant air, especially in heat stress conditions. Stagnant air means humidity buildup. Humidity means fungal pressure. He paused. You avoided that, not intentionally, but you avoided it. She stood there. Because, okay, because Vernon Haas had stood in a room full of her neighbors and called this system improvised, and now a county extension specialist was standing in the field telling her the improvisation had created better airflow than the commercial system Vernon had been selling for 3 years. She did not say that out loud. She just nodded and wrote it in the notebook. Irregular row spacing, airflow advantage, drought, heat conditions, not a flaw. Note. Brant looked at the notes she was making. You track everything, he said. My grandmother taught me that, she said, which was not technically true. Marta had been dead since Fenna was 9. She had never taught Fenna anything directly. But the notebook on the kitchen table had taught her, and that felt close enough. She was harvesting the last rows when she found what the east fence line had been hiding. Mid-September, the fruit was in. She was pulling the harvest bins off the upper section of the planting and working her way down. The light was that September slant that makes every farm in Wisconsin look like it has been painted rather than photographed. She was checking the base of the anchor post at the far east edge, the one closest to the old fence line that had been there since before Peter had taken over the property. Checking for frost heave damage that sometimes lifted post bases in the clay-heavy soil near the lower terrace. She knelt down, cleared the grass at the base, and stopped. Under the surface, just below where the topsoil transitioned into subsoil, the soil had a different structure, a fine dark striation running horizontally at about 18 inches deep. She had seen that kind of striation before in soil science readings. Organic matter breakdown. The kind you get when something biological has been decomposing in the soil for a long time. Root matter, old root matter, very old. She got the hand trowel from the harvest kit, dug carefully, about 8 inches of width, followed the striation. The pattern was horizontal, regular, at consistent intervals. The intervals were roughly 14 inches, which was, if you were thinking about planting density, which she was always thinking about, the spacing of a vine row. She sat back on her heels. Her throat did a thing it did sometimes when she understood something before she was ready to understand it. Someone had planted a row here. Not recently. Decades ago. The organic matter was fully broken down. No woody material left, just the ghost of it. The changed soil chemistry. The improved drainage. The dark striation that said something was here, and it lived and it fed the ground, and then it was gone, but the ground did not forget. She thought about the composition notebook with the cracked spine, about the sketch trellis diagrams, about the calculations that were almost the same as hers, about a woman at UW-Madison in 1971 who had proposed a thesis about exactly this hillside and had been told it was economically unviable and had never been allowed to plant the things she had spent years planning. And then she thought about Marta's family farm where Siv had grown up, 2 miles north, the Vanderholt property. And she thought about a woman who might have, in the early months of 1972, after her thesis was rejected before the family made her close her notebooks and do something practical instead, who might have come to this hillside, one row, just to see, just to know what it felt like to put something in the ground that she had spent years thinking about. One row, quietly, probably early spring, before anyone could stop her. And then she was stopped. And the vines were pulled, and the notebooks went into a box, and decades passed, but the soil remembered. Fenna sat on the hillside, the edge of her harvest, looking at the striation in the soil for a long time. The sun was dropping toward the ridgeline. The valley below was golden and exact. She did not cry. She just sat there, with the sense that the ground beneath her was not only hers, had never been only hers, had been waiting in the specific patient way that soil waits, which is slower and more certain than anything humans can manufacture, for someone to come back and finish what had been started. She covered the soil back over, smoothed it, went back to pulling harvest bins. She wrote it in the notebook that evening, small, neat, at the bottom of the September harvest notes. East fence line 18 inches depth root striation, row spacing 14 inches. Pre-existing planting evidence. Soil structure significantly improved in this section. Probably explains survival rate differential on East Row's winter one. She paused, then wrote below it, she actually came here, the September harvest that year, in the worst drought in 50 years, 3.8 tons per acre. Not her best number. The heat stress had reduced sugar development on the upper northeast section where the fruit exposure had been highest during the worst August days. She had expected that. She had written it in her projections as a possible reduction, but 3.8 tons, at $960 per ton, she sold to 3 wineries that fall. Peters and Spring Green was joined by 2 others, a small operation in Dodgeville that had found her through a regional agricultural cooperative, and a newer winery in Iowa County that had heard about the yield surviving the drought and wanted to talk. Net revenue per acre, $1,840. She wrote that number in the notebook. Then she wrote the number beside it. County corn average 2012 44 bushels acre. Net approximately $105 to $120 acre after input costs. And below that smaller hay baseline, same hillside 2007 $138 acre. She looked at those 3 numbers for a while. She did not say anything. She did not call anyone. But she did sit there for a long time, at the kitchen table, with the notebook open, with the stillness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for 2.5 years and has just quietly set it down. The phone call from Vernon Haas came on a Tuesday morning in late October. She almost did not answer, because the number showed up and she looked at it, and her entire body did a full internal review of every item on the agenda for the day, all of which was suddenly very pressing, very urgent. She answered anyway, because she did not know why. She just did. Fenna, Vernon said. It's Vernon Haas. I know, she said. A pause. I'm calling about the Farm Bureau meeting, he said. Emergency session, end of October, drought damage assessment. We're pulling together presentations from operations that want to speak. She waited. I'd like you to be one of them, he said. Silence, not long, but present. You want me to speak, she said. Your operation survived the summer, he said. People need to hear that. What you planted, how it held. She looked at the notebook on the table. The last time I spoke at a Farm Bureau meeting, she said, you called my system improvised. Another pause, longer this time. I know, Vernon said. That was all he said. Not I was wrong, not I'm sorry, just I know, the two syllables of a man who is not going to expand on what he knows, who has apparently come to a conclusion and is not ready yet to describe the journey. She looked out the kitchen window. The hillside was in that October state, leaves going copper and dark red on the vines, the wire catching the morning light in thin, bright lines across the slope. All right, she said. All right, he said. I'll speak, she said. End of October. What's the date? He gave her the date. She wrote it in the notebook. Thanked him. Briefly. Hung up. Sat with the phone on the table. Because here's the thing about being invited back into a room that you were laughed out of 2 years ago. It does not feel like victory. It does not feel like revenge. It does not feel like anything clean or satisfying that you might have imagined it would feel like on the cold drive home on the night it happened. It just feels like a room that you are going to walk back into and say what you said before, except this time the ground will have answered for you. The Farm Bureau emergency meeting in late October of 2012 was attended by more people than the spring meetings usually got. Hard years bring people out. The anger and the fear and the wanting to be in a room with other people who understand what you are carrying. She had seen that her whole life. Disaster in agricultural communities was communal in ways that good years never quite managed. She stood at the front of the same room. Same VFW hall, same folding chairs. Different faces, same people mostly, but their faces were different. The drought had done something to the certainty that usually lived in the faces of people who had been farming this county for decades. The certainty was still there, but quieter. Like it had been asked a question it did not have a clean answer for. She laid out the numbers. Her yield, her revenue, the variety performance, the trellis system's behavior through the heat-stress season, the root depth of the mature vines and what that had meant for moisture access in a summer when the surface soil had essentially stopped providing it. She spoke for 12 minutes. No one laughed. Vernon Haas sat in the third row, same side as always, but his arms were not crossed. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. And then a man in the back said, "Where did you get the trellis wire?" That question, she had not anticipated it. Not in the form it came, not in the frequency. Because it came again 3 weeks later from a different direction entirely. Otto Bergman, 62 years old, 40 acres of south-facing hillside in the next township. He had driven past her planting more times than she knew, and now he came down the lane in November and walked the rows with her and asked at the end of the walk where she had gotten her trellis wire. She explained. Wausow plant. Spool ends. Roland Getz. The arrangement. Would Getz do the same for me? Otto said. She said she didn't know, but she could ask. She asked. Getz said yes. No hesitation. Another name on the delivery list. And then 10 days after Otto came down the lane, Dora Kessler drove up in a gray pickup. Dora was 58. She had a small holding in the next county. Mixed operation. She had heard about the yield from the drought, which had apparently made its way around the cooperative network with significant velocity, and she had driven 40 minutes to ask a different question. Not can she contact Wausow herself. A different question. She wanted to know if Fenna could source the wire for her and sell it to her at a fair price. Fenna looked at her. You don't want to deal with the plant directly, she said. I don't have time to deal with the plant directly, Dora said. And I don't know what I need. You do. Fenna said she would think about it. Dora said fair enough, shook her hand, drove away. Fenna thought about it. For 2 weeks, with a notebook open to a fresh page. Okay, numbers. The Wausow plant was delivering spool ends at an average handling fee of $47 per load. Each load contains somewhere between 800 and 1,200 feet of wire. Across multiple gauges, The variable was real and significant, but the average was calculable. Call it 1,000 feet at $47. Effective cost roughly 4.5 cents per foot. Commercial trellis wire through agricultural supply dealers. She checked 3 dealers, pulled catalog prices, current market, 14 to 18 cents per foot. For the gauges she was using, she wrote that down. 4.5 cents out, 16 cents market price. Gap 11.5 cents per foot. She stared at that number because she had been receiving wire at 4.5 cents a foot for over 2 years, using it to build her own trellis, and she had thought of the arrangement entirely in those terms. As her supply line, her input cost advantage. She had never thought of it as inventory, but Dora Kessler was sitting in a gray pickup asking to buy from her, and there was 11.5 cents per foot of daylight between what she was paying and what the market was charging. She could sell at 10 cents, below market. Better deal for the buyer, still a significant margin for her. She ran the numbers. Full page, both sides. The available volume from Wausau based on current delivery pace. What a scaling arrangement might look like. Storage requirements, delivery logistics using the farm flatbed. The numbers were not life-changing, not yet, but they were real. And they existed in a space that had not existed before. Dora Kessler drove 40 minutes to ask a question. She went to the kitchen table that evening, told Peter and Siv what she was thinking. Peter listened without interrupting, which she had learned was his version of telling her he was taking it seriously. When she finished, he asked one question. Does Getz have capacity to increase volume if you need more than the current arrangement gives you? I think so, she said. I need to ask. Then ask, he said. He picked up his coffee. That was the whole thing. She drove to Wausau on a Thursday morning in January of 2013. The highway was clear but cold, the kind of January cold that makes the air look sharp, bright, every edge in the landscape precise and hard. She had the notebook on the passenger seat open to the planning pages she had been filling for 2 weeks. The Wausau plant was on the north side of the city. She had been there before, for pickup arrangements, for questions about wire gauge availability, but she had always called. She had not before today asked for a meeting. Roland Getz's office smelled like machine oil and old coffee. I was 60, big-framed, the kind of man whose handshake communicates more information than most people's introductions. She had read that about him in their first phone conversation 3 years ago, and it had proven consistently accurate. She sat down, laid out what she was thinking, formalized the arrangement. Right of first refusal on all spool ends from the facility, guaranteed volume commitment from her side, a slight increase in her per load handling fee in exchange for supply priority and scale delivery. She would become in effect a distribution point for his spool ends, sorting them by gauge, selling them to farmers and vineyard operations in a 4-county radius at prices below market. His disposal problem, bigger scale, her supply advantage, more consistent. She talked for about 8 minutes. Getz let her finish. Then he leaned back in his chair. We've been paying $420 a month for spool and hauling, he said. She had not known that number. Current arrangement with you saves us maybe 300 of that, he said, on a volume basis. She did a fast recalculation in her head, because that was a different picture than she had been carrying. If I scale up the volume I take, she said, you save more. Potentially all of it, he said. He looked at her. She looked at him. I had a flyer, he said, from your county extension office about connecting manufacturing waste with local agricultural operations. Came in my mail about 14 months ago. He turned and opened a desk drawer, pulled out a sheet of paper, slightly bent at one corner. I never sent it to anyone, because I didn't have anyone to send it to, and then your father's cousin mentioned you. He set the flyer on the desk between them. You found me before I found you. She looked at the flyer. It had been in a stack on the extension office counter. She had walked past that counter at least a dozen times that year. She had not taken the flyer. She had not needed it because she had been looking at the wire. I want to start in February, she said. February works, he said. I'll tell the floor supervisor to start accumulating larger volumes. She wrote the agreement terms in the notebook. He leaned over and read them as she wrote, nodded at each point. You want that typed up, he said. I'll type it up when I get home, she said. Sign it and send it back. Fine, he said. She stood up, shook his hand, walked out of the plant into the January cold, got in the truck, sat for a moment. The notebook was on the passenger seat. She opened it to the planning page, looked at the numbers she had been running for 2 weeks, the revenue projections on the wire distribution business she was about to officially start. She looked at them for a long time, not because they were large numbers. They were not large, not yet. This was a first year, a proof of concept, a 10-cent per foot margin on irregular volumes from a single plant. But she had paid $42 for 3 spools in September of 2009. And 3.5 years later, she was sitting in a parking lot in Wausau in January, having just formalized a distribution agreement that was going to solve both her wire supply problem and a manufacturing plant's disposal problem at the same time. For a margin that existed because she had seen something in a spool of wire that a factory had been paying to have hauled away. She started the truck, pulled onto the highway, the notebook open on the passenger seat. Colder outside, bright, every edge precise. She drove with the window cracked even in January because she needed the air, because the numbers were running in her head, and she needed the cold air to slow them down enough to hear them properly. Because that was how she thought, and there was a lot to think about. The first year of the wire arrangement, she still called it the arrangement. Not a business, not yet. The word business felt like a commitment she had not fully made. Like saying it out loud would require her to also say all the things that could go wrong. Which? She knew the things that could go wrong. She had been running those numbers too. But numbers don't care what you call them. In 2013, Fenna sourced and resold approximately 42,000 feet of spool-in wire to 7 farm operations across Sauk, Richland, and Vernon counties. Net margin after Wausau handling fees and her own delivery costs, using the farm flatbed, just under $3,000. She wrote that number at the top of a fresh page in the notebook, then sat with it. $3,000 was not transformative. She knew that. $3,000 was not the number that changes a life. It was not a headline. It was not a story anyone would tell. Except it was $3,000 that had not existed before, generated from material that a manufacturing plant had been paying to have hauled away. From wire that a man named Vernon Haas had called improvised in front of her neighbors. From an arrangement she had started because she needed trellis wire and did not have money and had found a place that had wire and did not want it. $3,000 proved the model worked, and a model that works is a model you keep building. The second year she added 2 more plants, one in Oshkosh, one across the state border in Rockford, Illinois. The process was the same. She called the plant managers, explained the arrangement, explained what the Wausau plant had been doing and why it worked for both sides. The disposal cost savings, the zero waste value, the farmers who needed this material and would pay a fair price for it. The Oshkosh plant manager said yes in 4 minutes. The Rockford manager took 3 days, called her back on a Friday afternoon. How much are you actually charging per foot? He said. She told him. A pause. That's less than half of market rate, he said. I know, she said. That's the model. Another pause. I'm in, he said. She added both names to the notebook. By the end of 2014, she had a reliable supply of somewhere between 120 and 160,000 feet of wire per year, across multiple gauges, from 3 manufacturing facilities. She had a customer base of 19 farm operations in 5 counties. She had run out of room in the equipment barn. That last part was the problem she had not projected. The wire needed sorting, by gauge, by approximate length, tagged, organized, available for quick inventory when a customer called with a specific requirement. It was not complicated work, but it was physical work, and it took time. And the equipment barn was already the equipment barn. Peter needed it to be the equipment barn. She mentioned this at dinner one evening in early 2015. You need help, Peter said. I know, she said. I know someone, Siv said. Which? Both of them looked at her, because Siv said things when she had something to say, but she did not usually lead with it. Arvid Holm, Siv said. His family farms out past the Bergman place. He finished his 2-year ag program last spring. He's been doing fencing and post work for 3 different operations. He knows wire. How do you know him, Fenna said. I know everyone, Siv said, simply, without elaboration, which was Fenna realized probably true. Arvid Holm was 23 years old and built like someone who had been doing fencing work since he was 16, which he had. He came out on a Wednesday morning in February of 2015, and she showed him the inventory system, the sorting process, the delivery schedule, the way she had organized the gauge categories along the east wall of the equipment barn. He walked the whole setup once, quietly. Then he picked up a coil of 14-gauge wire she had tagged incorrectly, turned it in his hands, checked the tension resistance with his thumb, and set it in the correct bin without saying anything about the error. Just corrected it, quietly. The way someone does when they understand a system and don't need to announce that understanding. She hired him the next day. $18 an hour, 2 weeks paid vacation, which was more than most farm operations in the county paid for comparable work. He stayed, which in agricultural labor was the only measure that mattered. By spring of 2015, Arvid was handling deliveries 3 days a week with the farm flatbed. Driving the routes, she mapped carrying inventory. She had organized talking to customers she had already vetted. He understood slope grades, understood why a farmer building a trellis on an irregular hillside needed different wire lengths than the catalog assumption. He had grown up on terrain like this. He had spent 4 years learning to read it. When customers had questions about installation, he could answer them. When they needed help with anchor placement on difficult grades, he could do that too. She paid him for it. Because here was something Fenna Dahl had understood clearly from the beginning. Maybe from reading her grandmother's notebooks, maybe from growing up watching Peter Workland, he respected. You pay people what the work is worth, not what you can get away with, not what the county average tolerates, what the work is worth. Because people who are paid what their work is worth stay and show up and care whether the system they are part of functions well. Arvid Holm stayed and cared. And the wire operation grew. By early 2016, the equipment barn had stopped being enough. She had looked at leasing a separate facility in Reedsburg for 3 months before she actually did it, because the leasing felt like a thing you did not do unless you were certain. And she was building towards certain, but she was not there yet. And then one Tuesday morning in March, she came into the barn at 6:15 to start the day's inventory sort, and there was simply nowhere to put the new delivery from Oshkosh. Every wall was full, every bin was full. The flatbed was parked outside because there wasn't room to fit it inside with the wire volume. She stood in the middle of the barn, looked at the wall of wire, looked at the equipment crammed into the remaining third of the space, looked at Arvid, who had arrived at 6 and was waiting. I'll call about the Reedsburg building today, she said. Good, he said. And that was that. Which brings us to April of 2016, which was a Thursday afternoon, which was the afternoon that changed the story from one about a woman building a business into a story about something harder to name. Something that had been between Fenna Dahl and Vernon Haas since an evening in April of 2010, when she had stood at the front of a room full of her neighbors and been dismissed in a way that was both public and strategic. She was in the equipment barn. The last of the wire inventory was still in the barn. The Reedsburg lease was signed, but the move had not happened yet. She was sorting a new delivery from the Oshkosh plant, coiling lengths by gauge, tagging with approximate footage, stacking on the east wall shelving. Arvid was out on a delivery in Vernon County. She heard a truck come down the lane. She stepped to the barn door and stopped. Vernon Haas's pickup, gray, The same one she had watched slow at the road in 2010 and 2011 when she was working the trellis installation on the hillside. The same truck that had never stopped. Until now. He got out. He was 67, the broad shoulders still, the purposeful walk still. But something in the carriage of him was different from the man who had sat in the third row at the Farm Bureau meeting, with his arms crossed and his certainty arranged around him like armor. She watched him cross the yard. He stopped at the barn door, looked at the east wall, the organized shelving, the coils sorted by gauge, the handwritten tags, the delivery manifest clipped to the board above the sorting table. The inventory system that had been refined through 6 years of daily use into something that a logistics consultant from Madison had recently described in a University Extension Service case study she had not asked for, but which had arrived anyway, as more efficient than most small-scale distribution operations he had seen. Vernon Haas had the look of a man who has driven somewhere knowing what he is going to find, and is still surprised to find it. "Fenna," he said. She looked at him. "Vernon," she said. A pause, not hostile, not warm, just present. The pause of two people who have a history that has never been fully spoken between them and who both know it. "I've been hearing about your wire operation," he said. "I suppose you have," she said. "I'm having trouble sourcing trellis wire for a customer," he said. "Larger vineyard operation over in Iowa County. 20 acres going in this spring. Specific gauge, specific quantity. My usual supplier is back-ordered 4 to 6 weeks." She looked at him. "He said you might be able to help," Vernon said. She set down the coil she had been holding. "I thought trellis wire built from spool ends was improvised, Vernon." She said it the way you say something you have been carrying for 6 years. Not with heat, not with satisfaction, just as a statement of fact. The room needed to hear it. Before the conversation could continue, Vernon's jaw tightened slightly. "I suppose I said that," he said. "You did," she said. A pause. "I spoke before I understood what you were building," he said, which was as close to an apology as she had expected. Except he did not stop there. And she had not expected what came next. He looked at the east wall, the shelving, the coils. Something moved across his face that was not the certainty she was accustomed to seeing there. "My father started a business," he said. "Agricultural supply, 1974. He stopped, started again. He was not a careful man. He expanded too fast, borrowed against projections that did not come true. By 1978, it was gone." She did not move. "I was 14, he said. I watched him lose everything he had built, in this county, in front of people he had known his whole life." He looked at the floor, then back at the wall. "I spent the next 40 years making sure I was never that man." A long silence. "Being certain was a way of being safe," he said. "If I was certain something would fail, it couldn't surprise me by failing." She stood there, because this was not the conversation she had prepared for. She had prepared for a transaction, for professional neutrality, for the invoice and the handshake and the quiet restraint of not saying what she actually thought. She had not prepared for this. "I understand," she said. She let that sit for a moment. "But your fear cost both of us," she said. "It cost me customers I should have had in 2010 and 2011 when I was still figuring out the volume. And it cost you—" She stopped, thought about the word. "It cost you the ability to see something that was right in front of you." He had no answer for that. He looked at the shelving again. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "I know." She walked to the inventory board, pulled the gauge he had described, checked her stock. "I can fill the Iowa County order," she said. "What timeline does he need?" "Before the end of April," Vernon said. "I can do before the end of April," she said. She wrote up the order. The price was fair, below what his back-ordered supplier would have charged, above her cost by the margin that kept the business running. She tore off the carbon copy and held it out to him. He took it, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. turned to go. At the door he stopped, didn't turn around. "What you've built here," he said, "it's something." She looked at the east wall, at the organized coils, at the delivery manifest, at the inventory system that was about to move into a leased facility in Reedsburg because it had outgrown the barn. "Thank you, Vernon," she said. He walked back to his truck. She listened to the engine start, listened to the gravel under the tires as he pulled out. Then she turned back to the sorting table, picked up the coil she had put down, went back to work, because there was still a day's work ahead of her, and the Iowa County order needed to be pulled and staged for delivery. And somewhere in the middle of all that, she would think about what he had said, about his father, about 1974, about the way that fear can dress itself up in the language of expertise and walk into a room and do real damage without ever admitting what it actually is. She would think about it. But later. Later, the Reedsburg facility opened in May of 2016, leased, a single-story building on the edge of town. Previous tenant had been a farm equipment repair operation. It had the right bones: concrete floor, high ceiling, loading bay with a grade that worked for the flatbed, wall space along the east and north sides that she converted to shelving within the first 2 weeks. The move took 3 days. Her, Arvid, Piter, who came on the second day without being asked and spent 6 hours helping move the heavy spool racks without once commenting on the scale of what he was looking at, which meant he was impressed. Peter communicated impressed through silence and sustained physical effort. The farm felt like a farm again after the equipment barn was cleared. Peter said so, once, walking past the empty barn, looking in. "Better," he said. She agreed. The vineyard was 18 acres by then, expanded across 3 parcels over 7 years. The second and third hillside sections she had mentioned to Peter on the morning after the Farm Bureau meeting. The ones he had offered her quietly over coffee, without looking at her, looking at the window instead. 4.3 tons per acre average on the mature planting, just over $1,000 per ton. Annual gross revenue from the grapes alone approaching $80,000. Against the hay baseline of $138 per acre that the same ground had been producing in 2007. But here was the thing: the vineyard was no longer the main event. It was still real. It was still work she cared about. It was still the thing that had started everything, that had required her to find the wire, that had connected her to Roland Getz in the spool ends in the $42 arrangement that had become an arrangement that had become a business. But the business was the main event now. Annual revenue from wire sourcing and resale in 2016, $138,000. In 2017, $172,000. In 2018, $211,000. She incorporated as Dahl Trellis Supply, LLC, in the spring of 2017. The papers were signed at a table in a lawyer's office in Reedsburg on a Tuesday morning. He had a practice that smelled like lemon furniture polish and looked out onto the main street. He handed her the papers. She signed. He said congratulations. She said thank you, drove home, walked the vineyard, ate dinner with her parents. That was the whole ceremony of it. By the time Lise was born in the summer of 2014, Fenna had stopped trying to separate the two parts of her life into different mental compartments: the vineyard and the business, the farm and the operation, the daughter and the person who ran things. It did not compartmentalize. It was all one thing, which is what happens when you build something in the place where you also live. On land your family has worked for 4 generations. In a kitchen where your mother still refills your coffee without being asked. On a hillside where your grandmother's hands, though she never knew it, had already worked the soil once before you. Lise grew up in all of it, the same way Fenna had grown up in the farm, in the middle of it, surrounded by it, learning its rhythms before she had language for what the rhythms were. She was helping sort wire in the Reedsburg facility by the time she was 5. Not production work, child work. The kind of sorting a 5-year-old does when they want to be useful and you give them a task that is real but not critical. Stacking tagged coils by color label. straightening rows on the lower shelves. By 7, she could read the gauge labels. By 8, she was pulling specific items from inventory when Arvid called out a request. By 9, she was asking questions. The kind of questions that Fenna recognized in her bones, that she had been asking herself at exactly that age, sitting at a different table, in a different kitchen, with a different stack of reading material, but the same quality of question. Fenna was invited to speak at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the spring of 2019. The Agricultural Economics Department, graduate seminar on rural enterprise development. The department had been following Dahl Trellis Supply through the Extension Service case studies and wanted to use it as a teaching example. She agreed. Because she was 32 years old and had been building something for a decade and had not yet been asked to explain it in a room where people were specifically trying to understand it. And she was curious what that would be like. Whether the things she had built would hold up to the kind of examination she remembered from those university classrooms. Whether it made sense in academic language. Whether it would still feel like hers after she had handed it over to a seminar. She drove down to Madison in early March. Highway 12, the same highway she had taken 10 years earlier, in the other direction. Coming home with a notebook under her arm, she took the same turnout above the Sauk City Valley where she had pulled over twice on that drive home. Parked, got out of the truck, looked at the hills. They looked the same, except she knew them differently now. The way you know a landscape that you have worked in, not the same as knowing a landscape you have looked at. The difference is everything. She got back in the truck. She had a stop to make before the seminar. The university library archives were housed in a building she had spent significant time in as an undergraduate. Different section than the one she had used for agricultural research. Deeper in, quieter, the kind of institutional quiet that feels deliberate, that feels like the building itself has decided to treat the materials inside it with a certain reverence. She had emailed ahead, explained what she was looking for. The archivist had the file box ready at the reading table when Fenna arrived. University of Wisconsin-Madison College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, Student Research Proposal Archive, 1968 to 1975. She sat down, put on the cotton gloves, opened the box. The files were organized alphabetically by student surname. She went to the V section, Vanderholt Marta E. The file was thin, a single proposal document stapled. The paper had gone slightly amber at the edges. The typewriting was even and clean. The kind of clean that came from retyping a page when you made an error because there was no other option. Title: Viticultural Potential of South-Facing Hillside Terrain in Sauk County, Wisconsin. An Economic Feasibility Assessment of Cold Hardy Grape Variety Cultivation. Her grandmother's name. On a research proposal about Fenna's hillside. She turned the page. The proposal was 12 pages. She read it, all of it, slowly, with the same attention she had given the UW Extension publications in 2009, because it deserved that attention, because whoever had written this had earned it. The methodology was sound, not as current as what Fenna had had access to. The Minnesota Cold Hardy Variety Program had advanced significantly between 1971 and 2009, but the underlying analytical framework was rigorous. The microclimate reasoning was correct. The revenue projections were conservative and appropriately caveated. The site selection rationale was specific and well-argued. This was good work. This was careful, serious, well-reasoned academic work. At the back of the file, clipped to the last page, was the Departmental Review Committee response. One page, stamped with the department letterhead. Fenna read it. The proposal was denied. The reviewer's notes were brief. 3 sentences. Proposed research site presents unviable commercial conditions for the variety selection suggested. Hillside terrain limitations in target region are well-documented barriers to viable agricultural development. Recommend redirection toward established crop viability research. She read it twice. Then she looked at the date. March 1971. She sat with the file for a long time. The archivist came by once to check if she needed anything. She shook her head, because she did not need anything. She had found what she came for. She photographed the proposal cover page, and the denial letter, and the site selection section with its specific Sauk County terrain analysis. Thanked the archivist, walked out of the building. The seminar room held 32 graduate students. She had not expected to recognize the room, but she did. Different furniture, different lighting, same bones, same south-facing windows that got the afternoon light in a slant she remembered sitting in the back row, 10 years earlier, reading cold, hardy variety research and writing numbers in a notebook, and not yet knowing what the numbers were for. She set three things on the table at the front of the room. The composition notebook with the cracked spine, Marta's notebook, in its plastic archival sleeve because she had been carrying it that way for 3 years. Her own first notebook, the one she had started in her junior year, the one with the $42 wire receipt tucked into the front cover, and the photograph she had printed that morning. The denial letter from March 1971, enlarged to readable size. She talked for 40 minutes. About the wire, about the hillside, about the $42, about Roland Getz and the spool ends and the formal arrangement, about the drought of 2012 and what the roots of a 3-year-old vine can reach that surface corn cannot, about Dora Kessler's question, about the Reedsburg facility, about Arvid Holm, about what it meant to pay people what their work was worth. She talked about building something from irregular materials on difficult terrain, and she talked about why the irregularity had turned out to be the point. Why having to solve each row as its own specific problem had taught her things that a standard installation would never have taught. Why the constraints she had not chosen had become over time the education she could not have bought. She passed the composition notebook around the room. The graduate students handled it the way people handle something that turns out to be the beginning of something larger than it appeared at the time. She watched them look at the handwriting, at the trellis diagrams, at the revenue calculations that were close to hers. Different year, different hand, same hillside. When the notebook had made its way back to her, she picked up the photograph of the denial letter, held it up, read the 3 sentences aloud, let them sit. Then said Marta Vanderholt, graduated 1972. She never published anything about this. She got married, farmed, raised a family, raised a daughter who raised me. She looked at the room. She died when I was 9. I found her notebook when I was 23, and my mother set it on the kitchen table and didn't explain it. Just set it down. She paused. I found this. She held up the denial letter photograph. Yesterday, in the archives 2 floors below us. The room was quiet. The committee that reviewed her proposal in 1971 and called it unviable. I don't know who they were. I don't hold it against them. They were working from the information they had, from the assumptions their field had built over decades. She set the photograph down. But I want you to understand something about what that letter cost. Not just Marta, not just the research that did not get done in the 1970s when it could have been useful. It cost the farmers in Sauk County who spent the next 40 years getting $138 per acre out of ground that could have been producing 2,000. She let that sit. Certainty is expensive, not just for the person who is certain, for everyone in the room. Another silence. Different this time, heavier. A hand went up from the back row. A young woman. She looked like she might be the youngest person in the room. Her question when she asked it came out slightly halting, like she had been deciding whether to ask it the whole time Fenna had been talking. What do you do, she said, when no one believes in you? The room went very still. Fenna looked at her. She picked up the 3 items from the table. Marta's notebook, her own notebook, the photograph of the denial letter. She laid them side by side on the table in front of her. You find the people who went before you, she said, who tried to do what you are trying to do, who were stopped before they could finish it. She looked at the 3 items on the table. They are always there. You just have to go looking. And when you find them, you understand 2 things. First, that what you see is real. because someone else saw it too, independently, before you were born, before you had the language to describe it. She paused. And second, that you are not starting something. She looked up at the room. You are finishing something. She looked at the young woman in the back row. That is what you do when no one believes in you. You find the people who believe before you, and you finish what they started. The room was quiet for a long moment, and then something moved through it, quietly, the way things move through rooms when the right thing has been said at the right time. Not applause, not yet, just a kind of settling, a collective acknowledgement. The older women in the room, the ones who had been students a long time and had heard many seminars and had learned to filter the things that were true from the things that were merely impressive. Several of them nodded, slowly. Once, the way you nod at something you have been waiting a long time to hear said plainly. She drove home on Highway 12, the windows cracked even in March because that was how she thought. She had the two notebooks on the passenger seat, side by side, the way they had been on the kitchen table that morning 10 years ago when Siv had set Marta's down without explanation and walked back to the counter. She thought about the young woman in the back row, about the question, what do you do when no one believes in you? She had given the seminar answer, the true answer, the answer she had lived and could stand behind. But there was a private corollary to it, a thing she had not said in the room, because it was too personal, too specific. The private corollary was this: sometimes the hardest part of not being believed is not the not being believed itself. It is the way the not being believed can get inside you and do its work even when you don't let it. Can make you calculate twice when once would do. Can make you sit at the kitchen table at 11 at night running numbers you already ran at 6. Because what if you missed something? What if Vernon Haas was right? What if 12% winter mortality is the beginning and not the anomaly? What if the drought is not your friend and the root depth doesn't matter? And what if? She knew how to stop the spiral. She had the notebook for that. Open to the revenue projections. Read the numbers. Numbers don't panic. Numbers are patient. That was the private corollary. But she had not said it in the room because some things you learn in private and they stay private. And some things are only useful once you have lived through enough winters to know that the spiral always ends, that the numbers are still there in the morning, that the hillside is still there in the morning, that the work is always still there. The summer of 2023, Dahl Trellis Supply generated just over $325,000 in annual revenue. That number appeared in the Reedsburg Agricultural Cooperative newsletter in July. A brief profile, half a page. The journalist was young and had asked mostly the right questions and had gotten the numbers right, which she appreciated. Peter found the newsletter on the seat of his truck where Siv had placed it. He read it in the cab. Then he brought it inside. She was at the kitchen table. Different notebook now, the fifth. Green hardcover. But the same table, same chair, same kitchen. He set the newsletter down, walked to the refrigerator, opened the junk drawer, and pulled out a magnet shaped like the state of Wisconsin. Pressed the newsletter to the refrigerator door, adjusted it slightly, stepped back. He picked up his coffee from the counter, walked out to the barn. Siv watched him go. He's been looking for a reason to use that magnet for 3 years, she said. Fenna looked at the newsletter on the refrigerator, at the Wisconsin magnet, at the number in the article. She opened the green notebook, wrote the number at the top of the July page, and went back to work. The magazine had been on the kitchen table for 5 days. Fenna had gotten through half of it. The second half was still folded open to a page about rotation crops on difficult terrain. She had meant to finish it. She had not gotten to it. She was at the sorting table in the Reedsburg facility on a Saturday afternoon in August when Lise came in. 9 years old, red and white sneakers, slightly muddy at the toe from the gravel lot. Her dark hair up in a clip that was losing its grip on one side, carrying the magazine. She had folded inside it a piece of paper. She set both on the sorting table in front of Fenna. The paper was divided into 2 columns. On the left, in Lisa's deliberate 9-year-old handwriting, what I know. On the right, what I need to find out. Both columns had items in them. The left column was shorter. The right column went down the whole page, because that is how it is when you are 9 and you have been thinking about something seriously. The things you know are few, and the things you need to find out are many, and you know enough to know the difference. Fenna looked at the paper, at the magazine, at the open article on industrial hemp as a rotation crop on hillside terrain. At the top of the north slope on their property, 2 acres that had been in grass cover for 4 years because the cold air pooled there in winter and the grape survival rate had been too low to justify the planting. 2 acres she had been thinking about for 2 years without landing on an answer. She looked at the 2 columns, at the right column, longer than the left, at her daughter's face. Large eyes, the expression of someone who has organized themselves carefully before presenting something and is now waiting for the response that will tell them whether the organization was worth it. Fenna picked up the magazine. Read the article. Not all of it. Half. Put it down. Looked at Lise. Yes, she said. Lise blinked. Yes, she said. Yes, Fenna said. We can try it on the north slope. A pause. You didn't finish reading it, Lise said. No, Fenna said. Lise looked at her. Processing. Why did you say yes before you finished? Fenna looked at the 2-column paper. At the right column with all the things still to find out. At the left column with the few things already known. At her daughter who was 9 years old and had come in with a system. With a piece of paper divided into what she knew and what she needed to know. With a question organized enough to be presented. With a look on her face that was serious and young and absolutely certain that the question was worth asking. Because I recognize the notebook, Fenna said. Lise looked at the paper, then at her mother. It's not a notebook, she said. It's a piece of paper. I know, Fenna said. She folded the paper carefully, tucked it inside the green notebook. That's where it lives now, she said. Lise looked at the notebook, at the sorting table, at the organized shelving along the east wall, at the inventory system that her mother had been building since before Lise was born, at the woman in the red flannel shirt in the worn canvas jacket who had built all of it from $42 in a problem she had not known she was solving. Can I help plan it? Lise said. Yes, Fenna said. Go get a notebook from the office shelf. Lise went. Fenna looked at the magazine open on the sorting table. At the north slope visible through the facility window. 2 unplanted acres in the late August light. She thought about soil structure, about root systems and winter hardiness and the drainage of that north section that made it cold in ways the south hillside was not. She thought about what industrial hemp needed from the ground and whether that ground could give it. She thought about a woman at a desk in 1971, writing the same kind of questions in a different notebook in a different room. She thought about the soil under the east fence line, the striation at 18 inches, the ghost of a row that had been planted quietly in early spring and then ended, and how the ground had held the shape of it for 40 years, waiting. She thought about all the things that do not end. They just wait, for the right person, the right season, the right question asked by a 9-year-old with a piece of paper divided into 2 columns. Lise came back. New notebook, spiral bound, green cover. She set it on the table, opened it to the first page, looked up at her mother. Ready? Fenna picked up her pen. Okay, she said. What do you already know? Lise looked at her 2-column paper, started talking. And Fenna Dahl, 36 years old, 18 acres of vineyard, 6 wire supply agreements, 4 full-time employees and 2 part-time, a leased sorting facility, a consulting practice booked 8 weeks out, a notebook on the shelf in Reedsburg in a plastic sleeve next to a framed wire delivery receipt for $42 dated September 2009. Fenna Dahl sat at the sorting table in the late August light and wrote down everything her daughter said.